Welcome to Winds of Change. Do you remember the stories you were told as a child and how intrigued you were about magical kingdoms far, far away? We wanted to dedicate today's show to all the lovely stories that have been passed down from generation to generation by storytellers. We have two amazing guests, Kira Van Deusen, who brings with her a Master of Arts in Folklore and Ethnography. And later in the show, we'll be joined by Mary Gavin, who's the previous president of the Storytellers of Canada. Welcome to the show, Kira.
Thank you, Jamie. Nice to be here.
So, Kira, let's start off with a little bit about your background and what intrigues you about storytelling.
Well, I was lucky when I was a little girl that I had a mother who loved stories, and she didn't really tell me stories, but she read them to me. She had a training in theater, so she read stories really well. Okay. And that was always just a big treat, and I came to love stories. I grew up and I became a professional musician, and I did that for many, many years, and it was a long time before I came back to thinking about telling stories, actually. Although during all those years, there was another kind of storytelling that took place, and that's what I call the kitchen table storytelling. Yeah. It's when we're sitting around like we are now and maybe talking through what happened during the day or something funny that you saw, or just things like that with friends. And I came to realize afterwards it was kind of how we made sense out of our lives too, was by telling over these things that had happened, what bothered us, what pleased us, things like that. But I never had an idea that storytelling was actually enjoying a revival as a performing art until about 1991. And then I was on Hornby Island. I had just moved there, and I had been working on trying to get the Russian language really flowing in my mouth again after some years of not using it. And I'd started reading some stories that came from peoples of Russia who are like the First Nations are here, you know, the indigenous people of Siberia. And I decided at this festival on Hornby that was going to happen that I would just try telling a few of them. And as it turned out, there were professional storytellers there. There were people that, if I'd only known who they were, it would have made me really nervous, you know, because they were quite big in the world of storytelling. And they encouraged me to go ahead. Something that intrigued me about those stories was that people are always making journeys to other worlds, and there were people who could change into animals, and there were animals that could change into people. I like those kind of stories very much. So one thing led to another, and it was fortunate for me, it was just about the time that the Soviet Union broke up. And before that, it would have not been possible really for me to visit the people whose stories I had been reading. But now suddenly it was possible. And not only that, they were quite excited to have people come and visit, because they, as one woman said to me, she said, you know, we've been living in a hole. Nobody knows who we are. They don't know that we're even here. And so I began to visit Russia, and I did that every year for about 12 years. I spent anywhere up to about 2 months of the year learning stories, and also just being part of a revival of culture that was going on in many ways in that part of the world.
So, Kira, like when I was a child, I grew up in a family that was very strong in an unofficial storytelling way, as you said, around the dining table. I grew up with my maternal grandparents. My grandfather, in his own way, was a storyteller, and moral-based stories. So stories that you knew that as you grew up, like now, you know, as I learn my life lessons, I often think back to, oh, that's what he meant by that story. Because at the time, it was, oh gosh, here he goes again. And we would sit through the story, and we knew at the end there was something that was going to be a power punchline that we would probably remember for years and years to come. Now, tell me about the art of storytelling. What is storytelling?
You're talking about moral-based stories. I mean, that's one kind of storytelling, and it's one of the important ways that stories have been used down through the ages. One of the women I talked to in Russia said that when she was a child, they were never punished. Instead, they would get sat down and told a story that would illustrate why what they had done was not such a good idea. And so certainly teaching in that way, and not just for children. Like we have to really always remember that it's not just for children, because it's kind of come to be seen that way in our own world today. But for everybody, there's good learning in stories. But there are other reasons that people have told stories down through the ages, and I think people have been telling stories as long as we've had language.
Of
it
course.
goes way, way back. Another thing that really comes to mind is history, keeping track of history. And just now, a lot of storytellers in Vancouver were working on an epic from Africa. And in many of the African countries, there was a griot, he's called, and he's a storyteller who is really a historian also, and knows all the generations back of the kings and what they did, and that's the way the history is passed down. And as you're passing down the history, and as you're listening to the history, you can also come to take pride in who you are and know who you are and where you've come from. So there's that historical aspect. And another thing I came to see too is that there is a spiritual aspect in storytelling too. And so it can aid our spiritual growth, just listening to the things that have happened in our own world and in other worlds.
And I find, as you said, with historical storytelling, it's also a form of passing down culture and tradition through those stories. Like if I think of Diwali, for example, which is a Indo-Canadian festival, I think about the story behind Diwali, and every Diwali I think of the same thing. I think, gosh, you know, that took a lot of commitment for storytellers to pass that story down generation to generation to keep it alive, so that my children or my grandchildren could know what that tradition or what that culture was about. So is that what you mean by historical storytelling?
Historical, I guess, both in the kind of history that we have in history books and certainly in the kind of thing that you're talking about. It's very important. And of course now it's a bit different in many places because people are not living in the same way that they lived before. And so remembering those things has a different kind of importance because they're not living in it every day. You know, sometimes I find that for some people that I've heard stories from, for their children, those stories are just as foreign really as they are for me, which is, I think, really a shame. But I think it's a great thing that they do continue to hear those stories.
Kira, what is so important about stories or storytelling?
I think it's important because it speaks to us really directly to our soul. A lot of things that we hear and read speak to our minds, but stories always really speak to us in our heart and our soul. And I think we need that. We all need it. And in the world that we live in today, we don't necessarily get enough of it.
Of course, and I find also that there was a presentation I went to once, and in that presentation the gentleman said, listen to the stories and remember the lessons. And so, you know, of course, when you get down to the lesson part, I don't know how many of us actually remember the lesson. And I know it may come up to us in certain times of your life. I know for me that when something happens, that's the trigger for me that I'll remember something that my grandfather said. And I'll remember, yeah, you know, that's probably what he meant by this story. Now, is there a certain art to storytelling?
Well, there is. And on the other hand, it seems to be something that everybody does and everybody can do. So it's a kind of funny mix that way. That there are, and there have been down through the ages, people who were real professionals and really, really excellent storytellers that you knew you liked to listen to. I don't know, one of the things that I've come to see about storytelling is when we get our own personality out of the way and just let the story come through. That's a fine thing. I think when I'm listening, and I judge by what happens when I'm listening. Because if when I'm listening, I just enter into that story and I start to see the landscapes and see the people and feel with the characters, then I know that story is being told really well.